So the second topic for our biochemistry lecture is all about your cell. So as what I have mentioned during our class, this will be just a review as to what are the different parts of your cells and their functions. So this will be our objective. So we'll go back to differentiating your two types of cell, identifying the different parts of your cell, and knowing its function and importance. We will also be discussing the different transport mechanisms, and we would also get to discuss the importance of water and its different properties. So very important po that we'll get to understand what is the role of water, especially in our body. So let us begin discussing what is a cell. So let us define what are cells. Now, cells are the smallest unit that is capable of performing any life functions, and it is considered to be our structural and functional unit. Any living organisms that you could think of, be it plants or animals. Now, it is also our building block of life, and it performs vital functions, and all cells contain hereditary information necessary for regulating cell functions and for transmitting necessary information to the next cell generation. Now, cells can also be connected to form a larger structure, and the best example as to pertaining what that large structure would be is, of course, your tissues. Like, for example, tissues in the stomach, and which would eventually form into your entire digestive system. So there are a lot of examples of a cell. As you can see, these are some images, which I know you are familiar with some of these. The first example would be your amoeba. Second would be regarding your plant stem. And then you have your bacteria, your nerve cell, and your red blood cells. So these are just some examples of your cells. And looking at these examples, we could actually group them into two. So now let us discuss your two types of cells. Now, as we all know, your two types of cells is or are your prokaryotic and your eukaryotic cells. Or in simple terms, they are your prokaryotes and your eukaryotes. So what are prokaryotic cells and what are eukaryotic cells? Now, prokaryotic cells do not have structures surrounded by membranes. They have very few internal structures and they are one-celled organisms. So, under your prokaryotes are your bacteria or even your archaea, and even yung amoeba, yung example natin kanina na amoeba. So, that is also an example of a prokaryote. While for eukaryotic cell kids, this one, it contains organelles, and most of the living organisms are have this type of cell. So, kung one-celled yung prokaryotic, then your eukaryotic cells are multicellular. And even tayo po, as mentioned, most living organisms, so that involves your plants, your animals, and even us. So, uh, this is the structure of a eukaryote and your prokaryote. And if you try to look at the internal, ba ito po yung internal pa lang na structure nila kids, very easy to differentiate. So that is why I have here a Venn diagram presenting the differences and similarities of these two types of cells. Now, in terms of your similarities, kids, they both have a cell or plasma membrane. They also have your cytoplasm, they have your ribosomes, and they have DNA. Now, in terms of your DNA, they differ. Both have DNA, but they differ in terms of how of their structure. Kasi for prokaryotes, it's a circular, while eukaryotic cells have a linear DNA. As to the other differences of your prokaryotes, so na-mention natin yung iba kanina, di ba, yung unicellular si prokaryote. Most of your eukaryotes are actually multicellular. They also differ in terms of size because most of your prokaryotic cells are small and simple, while your eukaryotic cells are large and complex. So, presenting already the size here, if you try to look at, di ba, 0.1 to 5 micrometer yung prokaryotes, whereas for eukaryotes, 10 to 100 siya. And then in terms of the chromosomes, single haploid for prokaryotes, paired na diploid yung chromosomes ng eukaryotes. So, since they are paired, that is why, di ba, yung total chromosomes rather ng mga eukaryotes are 46. And then, sa prokaryotes nyo, it's just the half of it, so that is 23. So, other than that, as mentioned also a while ago, na walang organelles or there are just a few for prokaryotes, while your eukaryotic cell has membrane-bound organelles. And then in terms of reproduction, your prokaryotes can reproduce either sexually and asexually, while most of your eukaryotic cells reproduce sexually. Binary fission, yung cell division ng prokaryotes, while via mitosis ang eukaryotic cells. And then these are already your examples. So now we go to the general cell structure, and the structure of your cell can be divided into three. Diba? Meron po tayong plasma membrane, your cytoplasm, and your nucleus. Now, in terms of discussing your cytoplasm, this can be divided into two, referring to your cytosol, which is yung fluid suspension ng mga organelles nyo, and then yung organelles mismo. Now, although this is a review, there is really a need to discuss each one of your organelles. So if you try to look at, di ba, ang dami-dami po talagang organelles inside your cell. But just a brief discussion or description lang din po sa iba, yung pinaka-important. Although you get to encounter again what the different cell structures along the way, lalo na kung darating kayo sa histology, I think may madi-discuss din po about cell structure. So now let us begin with the surrounding of your cell. And that is none other than your plasma or your cell membrane. Now it's just the same. Plasma membrane or cell membrane, again, they are just the same. And it is the outermost portion of your cell. It is the outer membrane of your cell that controls movement in and out of your cell. So we all know that your cell membrane is composed of a phospholipid bilayer, looking at this image. Kaya siya bilayer because it is grouped together. May isang line of phospholipids here and another here, grouped together forming a double layer. And your phospholipid bilayer, your plasma membrane, are composed of the following. So you could either find a protein, a cholesterol, or attached carbohydrates either inside or outside or lining lang sa cell membrane nyo. So in terms of your proteins, there are two types. It could be an integral protein or a peripheral protein. Now, as to your carbohydrates, may glycolipids and glycoproteins tayo. So before discussing the function of each, i-generalize po muna natin yung function ng cell membrane. Now, one of the main function of your membrane is in terms of being a barrier, diba? Barrier between inside and outside your cell, protecting the organelles, protecting what is inside. So para silang guard. And then it also controls the entry of your materials, whether there is a transporting ba inside or going outside to whatever substance that has been created by your cell. It also receives any chemical and mechanical signals to which they would also function depending on what signal is being given. And it also transmits signals between intra and extracellular spaces. So yun yung general function ng membrane nyo. And these are all that is attached. Yung image na makikita nyo po dito on your right, these are all examples of those that are attached to your cell membrane in order for this function to proceed. So now let us focus on them. So let us begin with your types of protein. Diba na-mention natin kanina, meron po tayong integral and meron po tayong peripheral. Now from the name itself, you would already get an idea as to what are the difference between the two. Diba? Integral, in integral from the word in to meaning these substances are literally inside naka-attach talaga dun sa cell membrane nyo, while your peripheral from the word peripheral, 'di ba, periphery, andun lang sila sa side. So just like here, another example of a peripheral protein, 'di ba? Andun lang naka-attach outside or sa periphery, while integral protein ninyo nakabaon gud siya didto sa inyuhang cell membrane. Now, most of your peripheral protein, their function is for signaling. So when we say signaling, cell-to-cell na signals, it means that they need to interact with other molecules or even change their conformation. And that is why peripheral lang sila kasi they are not temporarily attached to your cell membrane. Loosely bound sila wherein if humana ang function or nakahatag na og signal, then they could just detach and look for another cell. Whereas for your integral proteins, kids, they function as either transporters or carriers. Just like here, ito po, di ba, your channel protein, as you all know, kaya siya tawag na channel because it is considered to be somehow a tunnel or a bridge where your larger molecules can pass through in order to enter inside your cell. So kaya siya tinatawag, kaya yung mga integral na proteins nyo, they function as transporter, tig-transport sa mga different substances necessary. And then, another is your glycoproteins. Ito po, your glycoproteins and your glycolipids. Now, both contains carbohydrates. Yung naka-pair lang sa kanila is different. So from the name itself, di ba, glycoprotein, meaning this is a combination of your carbohydrate and protein. Glycolipid, meaning this is a combination of your carbohydrate and your lipid. So what are the roles of glycoproteins and glycolipids? Now, they are for cell-to-cell recognition. So what do we mean by cell-to-cell recognition? So meaning to say, kids, they can act as markers for identifying different cell types. And this is actually very crucial. Yung pag-identify ng mga different cell types nyo is a very crucial na process, especially for immune responses and tissue development. They can also serve as receptors for other types of molecules. And pwede rin po sila for adhesion. Lalo na kung kailangan na may binding together by different cells in order to form a larger, yung larger nyo na component like in order to form a tissue. So, ganun yun siya. And last that I would like to point out is this one. Ayun. Your cholesterol. Now, cholesterol is very important as it gives extra support and it also maintains stability and keep your membrane fluid in cold temperature. Kumbaga, cholesterol is dun siya sa fluidity talaga, stability and fluidity na every time there are changes in the temperature, outside temperature or environment, mura siyang tigpugong na hindi po agad-agad masisira yung cell nyo. So, ganun yung role ni cholesterol. So, again, ito po yung phospholipid nyo. I forgot to mention, kids, regarding the head and tails. Diba, that is how your phospholipids look like. Asa na ba yung to? This is how your phospholipids look like, and that in terms of its head and tails, the head are hydrophilic and your tails are hydrophobic. Mas klaro manggod ata diri na image, kids, so muna na nibalik ko diri na slide. Ayun. Hydrophobic head, hydrophobic tail, hydrophilic ang head. Yun. Okay. So since we are talking about transportation and such, so it would be best to also discuss how are your cell connections and communications are done. And one important function of your cell or one important portion of your cell that focuses on cell connections and communications are what we call your cell junctions. So before pointing out your three types of cell junction, so might as well discuss what are your cell junction. Now, cell junction, from the word junction, diba, so junction pa lang, you get an idea na ang role ni cell junction is in terms of connecting individual cells together into a multicellular na organism. So, cell junctions would play a crucial role, kids, in maintaining your tissue integrity, in enabling your communication between cells, and it also facilitates coordinated function within your tissues and organs. So, that is how important your cell junctions are. So, what are the three types of junction now? We have your gap junction, your desmosome, and your tight junction. So, for your junction, these are when two cells are right next to each other, their cell membranes may actually be touching. For desmosomes, they physically connect cells like the gap junction, but no opening is created. While for your tight junction, it happens when two membranes actually bond into one. So to further explain the difference between gap, desmosome, and tight junction, take a look at this image, kids. Diba? Dito pa lang, sa image ng cell junction nyo, pointing out these three different things, you will already get an idea as to their difference. And even just by looking at their name, andun na actually yung difference nila. Although medyo mahirap mag-imagine as to what desmosomes are. But with your tight and your gap, ayun na. Sa name pa lang nila, andun na yung clue nyo. When we say tight junction, kumbaga, kaya siya tight because they form a solid wall. So look at this portion, 'di ba? Solid wall siya. And being a solid wall, meaning to say it is impermeable to any substances. When we say impermeable, kids, nothing could get through. Other than siguro in terms of regulating the movement of your water, but basically, your tight junction is, ito po yung function. It prevents molecules from passing through your intercellular space. And one best example for those organs having a tight junction would be the lining of your digestive tract and even dun sa urinary bladder nyo. Take note that when we are talking about your digestive tract, especially small intestines, di ba, we are trying to absorb nutrients, and that food is being passed through, di ba, it passes through your stomach and your small intestine. And imagine if hindi impermeable yung junction na andun, then meaning to say there would be leakage. Diba, na ay leak na mahitabo sa unsa man ang mga substances na mag-pass through dira na mga organs ninyo. Imagine urinary bladder, diba, na andun yung urine nyo, and if hindi impermeable yung lining ng tissue nyo dun, then again, your urine will leak into our body and might be na magkakaroon ng diseases or magkakasakit yung patient. So, yun yung tight junction nyo. How about your desmosomes? Now, desmosomes are anchoring junction. Meaning to say, kids, it's like imagine a Velcro. So, kaya naglagay po ako dito ng image for those who do not know what a Velcro is. Na, diba, it's like a type of fastening or siyang fastener na instead na mag-staple or what mo, so pwede lang ninyo siya kanang i-pull apart, then pwede lang po ninyo siya ibalik o close. So, ingana ang inyuhang desmosomes, and it forms an internal tension-reducing network of fibers and plaques on surface of membranes attached to protein filament. Kumbaga, very important si desmosomes from preventing any pulling apart of those organs in our body na grabe yung tension. And one best example for that is, diba, ang heart muscle nyo. Remember that your heart muscles are always contracting. And without your desmosomes, unsa na lang kaya ang mahimong force or feels ana sa ato ang body. So kaya nga siya tension reducing na network. Another example for an organ having a desmosome are your skin. Diba? Remember your skin, night times na diba, ma-pull siya or whatsoever. So, masking unsang tension or force that we try to apply in our skin, it does not easily break or damage. Dili siya agad-agad ma-broken down or damage. And that is because of your desmosomes. Lastly, your gap junction from the word gap, meaning to say there is a space na ay space sa inyuhang kaning siya na junction na ay gap, 'di ba? Looking at this image here sa pang third. And that gap, that opening allows for intercellular communication. So meaning to say with gap junction, it allows ions and small molecules to pass through your channels formed by your connexon protein cylinders. So as to your connexon kids, these are just what your gap junctions are made of. And an example of this one, ito, found in electrically excitable tissues like your heart or your smooth muscles for synchronization. So those are your three types of cell junction. So to give you a further, diba, further look or better look, so yan yung tight junction nyo. Ayan, walang opening, very tight, very solid. Kay desmosome nyo, it's not actually a gap, but something like a rubber substance. Ito na will just open, kumbaga parang magsaslide in and out to facilitate contraction. Ito yung gap junction nyo. Just imagine your channel proteins na may gap in between your channel proteins where your molecules are able to go in and out. Now, there are actually other names for these different types of junctions. For your tight junction kids, it is otherwise known as your occluding junction. For desmosomes, these are called as your anchoring junction. For your gap junction, this is what we call your communicating junction. Okay? So, other terminologies that you need to remember is with regards to your different types of body fluid pools. Now, our body fluid inside the body can be divided into two. You have your intracellular and your extracellular. From the word intra meaning inside, extra meaning outside. So looking at the image here on your right, when we say intracellular kids, it refers to the fluid inside your cell. Kaya as written here, andito po yung intracellular fluid nyo. And this actually comprises around 2/3 of the total body fluid that we have. The rest of the 1/3 are your extracellular fluid na. And that your extracellular fluid can be divided into 3. So you have your interstitial. Ito po yung interstitial. So we define interstitial fluid kids as the fluid that fills the spaces between your cells. So ato po, fills the fluid. So lahat po nito dito basta outside, in between cells, these are all interstitial fluid. While your plasma, it surrounds our blood vessels. And then the other name for your plasma is actually intravascular. Again, other name for your plasma is intravascular fluid, and this is the fluid that is filled in our blood vessel. We also have a somewhat special type of fluid, which is your lymphatic fluid, which comes from your lymph. And when we say lymphatic fluid, again, coming from your lymph, going out or passing through your lymphatic vessel. Now, yung lymphatic fluid nyo, it is a collection of an extra fluid that drains from your cells and tissues in your body. And ang isang role nila, kids, is in terms of for balance and defending our body against infection. So, yun yung mga lymph or lymphatic fluid nyo. Next, we have the following. So when we say solvent, it is the liquid doing the dissolving. and it is usually your water. Di ba? Remember that that water is defined as your universal solvent, whereas yung dissolved na material, be it particles or gas, that is what we call your solute. Concentration is defined as the amount of solute in a given amount of solvent, while concentration gradient is the difference in concentration between two areas of solution. So now let us discuss the different transport mechanisms. Now, there are two types of transport mechanism in our body. It could be passive or it could be active. Now, the image on your right would already give away the difference between passive and active. And ano yung number one na makikita nyo na difference? That is in terms of the use of energy. Kaya lang naman siya tinatawag na active because what is needed are or it requires energy in order to push through with its function, whereas passive transport does not. And there are two different types of passive transport, that would be your diffusion and your osmosis. Under diffusion, may two types din po. You have your simple and your facilitated. How about your active transport? Active transport, may two types din po. You have your endocytosis and you have your exocytosis. So let us discuss the difference of each, starting with your passive transport, and that is your simple diffusion. Now, the principle behind your simple diffusion, kids, is that it spreads your molecules from an area of a high concentration to an area of a low concentration, and that is referring to this image. So when your molecules are even throughout a certain space, that means that it already reaches an equilibrium. And when we say equilibrium, it means na balance na po ang both area or all areas in a given space or in a given space. So the very reason why passive transport does not require energy, imagine walking up and down a stair. Diba? Pag nasa taas po kayo at bababa, going down the stairs, di ba mas easier siya and it does not actually require much effort to go down rather than to go up. Di ba mas kapoy biag yun mo bakta sa stairs na pasaka kaysa sa baba. And that is actually already a simple explanation why a passive transport does not require energy, because it does not go against its concentration gradient. Diba, from a high concentration to an area of low concentration. So yun yung keyword natin for your passive transport. It does not go against the concentration gradient. So ganyan lang po yung simple diffusion nyo. Sadyang it is able to just diffuse, just to spread out, going from a high to a low concentration, trying to even out all areas in our body. Kung saan man kailangan mag-reach dapat ng equilibrium. Diba yan yung pinaka-aim ng ating different processes in the body, that it should remain, all of the substances should be balanced. Dapat andun sa normal na range. So, anything na makakapagtaas or baba ng values ng ating substances, then that would entail for us to have a certain effect and conditions or diseases na agad-agad. So, how about your facilitated diffusion? Yes, it does not need still. Di pa rin siya kailangan ng ATP. It does not go against your concentration gradient. What differs your simple and facilitated diffusion is ito po na requirement. This time around, our molecule needs a carrier or a channel protein. Yun, carrier or channel protein. Or sometimes it is also called as a gate for it to enter. And the very reason why these molecules or ion needed a carrier or a channel protein, it's because of its size. Na kumbaga, dako ra kaayo siya, na tipong dili siya able na muagi lang sa inyuhang cell membrane. So muna na naatay ibutang na channel protein, didto muagi ang inyuhang mga molecules. Now, maximum transport speed will depend on the number of carriers. Just like, for example, our insulin, the effect of insulin, kids, remember that insulin, ang role ni insulin is to decrease your glucose. And that is why insulin is, mauna siya ang tambal. That is one of the medications being given to individuals that have diabetes. So the action of your insulin, kids, in order to decrease glucose level is in terms of increasing also the number of carriers. Because the more daghan ang carriers, the more paspas ang pag-enter ni glucose into our cells, decreasing its amount outside. Ganun yung concept. But anyway, further and deeper understanding about insulin and glucose will be discussed later on and during your clinical chemistry na subject. So this is how your channel proteins would look like. Diba? Again, this channel proteins are an example of your integral protein, and their roles are more on as a carrier and transporter. So ito lang, kids, once na may glucose na mag-enter, mag-open and close lang din po yung ating channel protein until such time that your glucose will enter into your cell. And ito yung mga channel proteins ang ini-increase ang number ni insulin para mabilis rin po yung pag-facilitate sa entry ni glucose in order to decrease glucose outside our body. Okay? So how about osmosis? Now, whenever we talk about osmosis, will always refer to your diffusion of water. So this is referring to the diffusion of water across your selectively permeable membrane, and that whenever we mention the word selectively permeable, this means that they are permeable to your solvent and impermeable to your solute. Meaning to say, pilian, kumbaga, mo biya ang inyuhang cell membrane na selectively permeable ba na sila, na meaning it will only allow some molecules to go through and some will not. So, there are different types of solutions that may surround a human red blood cell, and that different types of solutions could affect how our red blood cell would look like. So, natay tulo, we have an isotonic solution, a hypotonic solution, and a hypertonic solution. So, when we say isotonic, meaning to say solution outside your RBC has the same concentration of solute as your red blood cell. And one example of an isotonic solution would be your 0.9% NaCl. For hypotonic, this means na lower, from the word hypo, meaning lower ang concentration outside compared sa inside. And an example of the concentration of your NaCl here would be 0%. And what happens here is that it may cause hemolysis. So when we say hemolysis, meaning may destruction sa red blood cell nyo. While for hypertonic, kids, from the word hyper, meaning high yung concentration, just like when we use around 4% of your NaCl, and what happens in your red blood cells is that it will crenate or it will shrink. Now look at the image here in your right side. This is your isotonic, your hypotonic, and your hypertonic solution. Ito yung effect ng red blood cells nyo. So, syempre for isotonic, since same lang yung concentration inside and outside, then your RBC will retain its normal shape. Unlike hypo and hypertonic, na either mag-swell or mag-shrink. So, mag-swell until na ma-destroy, mag-shrink until na mag-crenate. So what is the reason behind the swelling and the shrinking of your red blood cells? Now, unahon nato inyuhang hypotonic. When we say hypotonic ang solution, kids, meaning baba ang solute, taas ang water content ninyo ani. Now, remember that we need to reach an equilibrium, meaning to say balance lang po dapat yung nasa inside and outside ng inyong red blood cell. Now, since there are more water outside, ang tendency, kids, yung RBC nyo, yung excess na water ipapasa, it will be given to your red blood cells, causing your red blood cells to swell. That is because of too much water. And until such time na if it exceeds already its capacity niya na kunwari nagsobra na 100%, so kaya ang tendency pwede siya mag-burst, causing hemolysis. Now, how about your hypertonic? For hypertonic kids, dito kabaliktaran ni hypo na dito mas marami yung solute, your water here is very low. And since water is very low, what our RBC will do is that it will give off the water na andun sa kanyang loob, causing it to shrink until such time that it will already crenate. So, ganun yung difference ni hypo and hyper. Ganun yung reason behind why it will swell or why it will shrink. It is really because of the level of water inside and outside, wanting it to reach an equilibrium. So, another thing that could explain osmosis or movement of your water is in terms of this experiment. So this is by the use of your U flask or tube, by U, literal na letter U, wherein we will be placing here in between the tube a selectively permeable membrane. So here sa left portion nyo, ang ilalagay natin is a hypotonic solution. On the other side is a hypertonic solution. Now, after filling this in, wait for how many minutes up to an hour, and then check ninyo balik kani ang mahimong result. And what did you observe? Diba, there will be an increase in the level of water on the left side of your tube. That is because kasi dito sa hypertonic solution nyo, diba mas marami yung solute compared sa water level nyo. And since dito sa kabilang side nyo, there are more water compared to solute, so ang mangyayari, yung water na sobra sa hypotonic solution nyo, it will diffuse to the other side just to balance out the concentration. So, ganun yung osmosis nyo, kids. So, that is why our rule for osmosis, just remember, salt sucks, meaning to say, where your salt is, water will always follow. Kung saan may maraming solute na concentration, your water will always diffuse and go there. If the area outside your cell has more salt, then your water will be sucked out of your cell. Para again, our aim here is to maintain equilibrium. Okay? I hope na gets po siya. Next, we go to your active transport. So here, we already need an energy. And the reason behind requiring ATP, kids, di ba mo, mangyud na siya nga itong energy. ATP, that is your adenosine triphosphate. Just in case hindi nyo po alam yung meaning, that is your adenosine triphosphate. And this is our highest form of energy. Kaya kailangan niya ng energy because we are going against our concentration gradient. Diba? From a low concentration to a higher concentration. And what your active transport needs, it still requires a carrier, but the carrier here is what we call a pump. And literal ang action, kids, diba? Think of a pump, any pump na ginagamit natin in certain situations. Diba, when we say we need to pump a certain thing, diba, murag na atay certain force na ginahatag. So, ingani ang pump pod para sa inyuhang active transport na kailangan yun siya mugamit og force in order to transport and carry that certain molecule. So, active transport is very critical for moving important ions, and one major active transport in most cells, found in most cells, are your sodium-potassium pump. Also, active transport is done for the reabsorption of your glucose, amino acids, and salts, particularly in the proximal convoluted tubule portion in your kidneys, specifically sa nephron ng kidneys nyo. Siya makikita. So to explain, your sodium-potassium pump, let us look at this image. Now, your sodium is commonly found outside your cell. Your potassium is commonly found inside your cell. Now, there may be cases that our cell needs to exchange these two ions because it might be na basi diay mas baba diay ang sodium inside your cell or mas kailangan og potassium outside kay dili na balance, wala na sa normal range. So, in every 3 sodium that is being expelled, there are 2 potassium that is being imported. And every time that there is an exchange between these two ions, ATP will always be involved. As of this moment, ana lang sa ang inyuhang tandaan. Again, it does require energy because we are trying to force the entry or exit of ions because we are going against our normal concentration gradient. So this is already a summary between your passive and active. Ito po na letter A, this is referring to your simple na passive transport. Tapos, of course, letter B is your facilitated transport and lastly, your active transport. And di ba, ito po yung sinasabi ko na yung carrier protein nyo can be called as your gate or channel proteins, but for your active transport, that would be your pump. And looking at here, na-explain kung ano yung concentration gradients nila and if need ba ng energy. Okay? So again, there are 2 other types of active transport, and that would be your endocytosis and your exocytosis. So starting with your endocytosis. Now, from the word endo, kids, di ba ang endo is referring to inside. So what happens here in your endocytosis is that there is taking in of your large molecules by your cell in order for it to be important. So look at this image here at the center. This is what happens during endocytosis, kids, na tipong gina-engulf nato ang kaning certain na substance taking it in. And there are 2 types of endocytosis. It could either be your phagocytosis or your pinocytosis. I hope you're already familiar with the word phagocytosis because this is being done by your white blood cells, especially if they wanted to ingest mga foreign materials in our body, just like your bacteria. But it comes from the word food, meaning we are taking in food particles. The difference lang between phagocytosis and pinocytosis, kaning phagocytosis, kids, kay mga solid particles. Pag liquid na gani na siya na form, that would be your pinocytosis. So, best example for pinocytosis, kids, is yung process na nag-o-occur dun sa lining ng small intestines natin. And di ba, remember, we are trying to absorb nutrients, and in terms of the kung ano yung specific na substance na nag-undergo ng pinocytosis dun sa small intestine nyo, that would be in terms of the absorption of your fat droplet. Kasi diba, from the word droplet, so meaning these fats are in liquid form. For exocytosis, from the word exo, meaning outside, so what we do here is that we are trying to remove large particles and exporting our materials out of the cell, just like what you can see here in our image. And best example for an organelle that does exocytosis is your mga katuinyuhang Golgi apparatus. Na by the time na naa na sila'y mapak, di ba, i-release biya na nila ang ilahang mga napak na proteins ba na siya or kung unsa man na siya na substance, di ba, i-release man na nila. And they release those substances through exocytosis. Sige. So I will be presenting to you a video, kids. This is just to summarize everything. So especially to those students na mas makasabot when naa sila gyud videos or movies or kanang mga movements na makita. So kindly watch this video. Pero kung nakasabot na, then actually pwede ramang yun ninyo siya skip. So it's up to you, but I would highly suggest for you to watch this to understand the lesson about transport mechanism further. Sige, so let us start. Sorry for that, kids. Wait lang.
wondered what it might be like to be inside a cell? Imagine the genetic material, the cytoplasm, the ribosomes. You'll find those in almost all cells, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Eukaryote cells, in addition, have membrane-bound organelles. All of those structures and organelles have different functions, but cells are not isolated little worlds. They do have a lot going on inside them, but they also need to interact with their environment. It makes sense that to keep a stable environment inside themselves, otherwise known as keeping homeostasis, they must have some control on what goes in and what goes out of them. A very important structure for this that all cells contain is the cell membrane. By controlling what goes in and out, the cell membrane helps regulate homeostasis. It's the homeostasis king. Let's take a look at the cell membrane. You could have a whole course on the cell membrane itself. It has amazing structure. It has signaling abilities. But to stick to the very basics, it's made of a phospholipid bilayer. Bilayer means two layers, so you have these two layers of lipids. Now, these lipids, they're called phospholipids, well, they have a head that is polar, and they have a tail that is nonpolar, making them quite unique. Some molecules, they have no problem going through the cell membrane, and they directly go through the phospholipid bilayer. Very small, nonpolar molecules, they fit in this category. They're a great example. Like some gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide gas, those are great examples. This is known as simple diffusion. Also, it doesn't take any energy to force those molecules in or out, so it's known as passive transport. Simple diffusion moves with the flow, meaning it moves with the concentration gradient. Molecules move from high concentration to low concentration. So when you hear someone saying that something's going with the concentration gradient, that's what they mean. They mean it's going from a high concentration of molecules to a low concentration of molecules. Now, remember how we said the cell membrane is actually a pretty complex structure? Well, one thing we haven't mentioned yet are proteins in the membrane, and some of them are transport proteins. Some transport proteins act as channels. Some of these proteins actually change their shape to get things across. Some of them open and closed based on some kind of stimulus. All of these are good things because it's helping with molecules that may be too big to cross the membrane on their own, or molecules that are polar and therefore need the help of a transport protein. This is known as facilitated diffusion. It's still diffusion, and it still moves with the concentration gradient of high to low. It doesn't require energy, though, so it's also a type of passive transport. It's just the proteins are facilitating or helping things pass. Charged ions often require a protein channel in order to pass through. Glucose needs the help of a transport protein to pass through. In osmosis, for water to travel at a fast rate across the membrane, it passes through protein channels called aquaporins. So these are all examples of facilitated diffusion, which is a type of passive transport and moves with the concentration gradient of high to low concentration. Now all the transport we've mentioned has been passive in nature. That means it's going from high concentration to low concentration. But what if you want to go the other way? For example, the cells lining your gut, they need to take in glucose. But what if the concentration of glucose in the cell is higher than the amount of glucose concentration in the environment? We still need to get the glucose in, so it's going to have to be forced against the regular gradient flow. Movement of molecules from low to high concentration will take energy because that's against the flow. Typically, it's going to require ATP energy. A reminder that ATP, adenosine triphosphate, it has 3 phosphates. And when the bond for the last phosphate is broken, it releases a great amount of energy. Yeah, so ATP is a pretty awesome little molecule. ATP can power active transport to force molecules to go against their concentration gradient. And one way it can do that is actually energizing the transport protein itself. One of our favorite examples of active transport is the sodium-potassium pump. So that's definitely something worth checking out. There's other times a cell needs to exert energy for transport. We're still in active transport right now, but let's say a cell needs a very large molecule. Let's say a big polysaccharide. If you check out our biomolecule video, that's a large carbohydrate. Well, you may need the cell to fuse with the molecules it's taking in order to bring it inside. And this is called endocytosis. Think endo for in. Often, this fusing of substances within the cell membrane will form vesicles that can be taken inside the cell. Endocytosis is kind of a general term. There are different types of endocytosis depending on how that cell is bringing substances inside. Amoebas, for example, rely on a form of endocytosis. In this example, pseudopods stretch out around what they are going to engulf and then it pulls it into a vacuole. And there are other forms too, such as the fancy receptor-mediated endocytosis. This is where cells can be very, very, very picky on what's coming in because the incoming substances actually have to bind to receptors to even get in. Or penocytosis, this allows cells to take in fluids. So to the Google to find out more details of the different types of endocytosis. Exocytosis is the reverse direction of endocytosis. Think exo and exit. They sound very similar too. Exocytosis can be used to get rid of cell waste, but it's also really important for getting valuable materials out that the cell has made. Want a cool example? Well, think back to those polysaccharides. Did you know that large carbohydrates are also really important for making plant cell walls? Cell walls are different from cell membranes. All cells have membranes, but not all cells have a wall, but plant cells do. And if you're going to make a cell wall, you're going to need to get those carbohydrates that are produced in the plant cell out of the cell to make the wall. So there's a great example of when you'd need exocytosis right there. Well, that's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
Ayan, kids. So, I hope na nagkaroon ng deeper understanding about your different transport mechanism and that na ay mga some clarifications pud na na-explain. Diba? Nindot biya pud ni sila Amoeba Sisters. They have very nice videos, video presentation regarding mga ingani. So, I will cut off the discussion. This will serve as your cells na discussion na part 1 since it's already almost an hour. And I will just send another continuation, another video for the continuation, and we will already be discussing your different organelles. So, this is pud na para somehow kanang murag na pud mo'y break or cut sa ato ang sa pagpaminaw. So, I do hope you learned a lot, kids, and we'll continue on the next video. Thank you so much for listening. God bless.